The reason this is important is the topic that we would be tackling with, and I'm just going to wait before we talk about the topic and the presenter that I'm very honored to have at the conference. We have been trying to have you come for at least 4 years. So finally it has happened. So, okay. So our keynote speaker is Juliane Hammer. She is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She specializes in the study of gender and sexuality in Muslim societies and communities, race and gender in US Muslim communities, as well as contemporary Muslim thought, activism, practice, and Sufism. But most importantly, I loved this book, and that's what we are focusing on today. She's the author of several books, including Peaceful Families, American Muslim Efforts Against Domestic Violence. She has also written about American Muslim women, religious authority, and activism. So today's topic is Islam as a resource and roadblock, working against domestic violence in Muslim communities. Because even as a mental health provider in my work with intimate partner violence, we see that domestic violence is either denied, avoided, or minimized in the guise of culture and religion. So, which we know is actually a religious, ethical, and moral failure. So I look forward to Associate Professor Juliane Hammer's presentation. Thank you so much.
Yes, high as you can, speak as loud as you can. I'm loud. I can do that. Loud. That's perfect. All right. Can you hear me? Is it loud enough? Closer? Really? Right here? A little bit more closer. Okay. Well, that means I'll have to walk. Okay. So, bismillah. So I want to start by thanking Dr. Hamada Talib and Dr. Farah Abbasi, as well as Mary Firdausi. You two for the invitation, and Mary for all the work that she's done to actually get me here in person. I also want to say that I'm really, really honored to be here. You all are not, in disciplinary terms, my crowd. Right? And so it's really important. It was really important for me when I was working on the book that I'm going to be telling you about to reach beyond my own field of study, which is religious studies, and within that, Islamic studies. And so I'm hoping and praying that this presentation is useful for you in some way, and also that it contributes in some small way to the fight to eradicate domestic violence in our communities and societies, which I know is a lofty goal, but that's what I'm striving towards. It's not working. Oh, okay. Aha, here we go. So, and I want to dedicate this talk today to my sister, friend, mentor, and colleague, Dr. Deborah Majid, who returned to her creator less than a week ago, unexpectedly and shockingly for many of us. She was both a gifted scholar whose work on women and families, marriage and polygamy, and most recently widows in our Muslim communities, is only rivaled by her tireless and often invisible advocacy for social justice and gender justice. May she rest in power. So as I said, My talk today is drawing on my book, which I will tell you a little bit more about in a minute, which was published in 2019. And I will admit here, even though many people in at least my part of the profession don't, that I've not been able to do much research at all during the pandemic. It's been a really challenging time. Most of my energy has gone to surviving, caring for people in my family and caring for my students, both undergraduate and graduate. And so I freely admit that research has not been terribly high on my agenda. While at the same time also recognizing, because the theme of the conference is related to the pandemic and the hopefully maybe post-pandemic situation that we're in now, that the pandemic itself, and we all know this, and you know this better than I do, and the lockdown situation, especially that was part of at least the first year of it, has increased incidence of domestic violence. There's absolutely no question about that. But it has also increased the silence around domestic violence, partly because vital services were cut off because everyone was in lockdown, and partly because the struggles of the pandemic itself, the economic struggles that followed for many people, the loss and the trauma of the pandemic have made it, in my experience, at least in my observation, even more difficult to talk about domestic violence. So I put up here this tile, which, as you will see in a second, is part of the cover of the book Peaceful Families. And I want to start with this. This tile sits on a shelf in my office and has been sitting there for a really long time now. Initially, it was just a tile that I bought in Istanbul at one point in my life, many, many years ago. And then it was a tile that someone dropped and broke. And because I loved the design so much, I decided that I was going to glue it back together. And eventually it became a constant reminder for me of a really profoundly important question that's also a religious or a spiritual question for me, which is how we as humans deal with trauma. How do we deal with the fact that many of us have fallen and are broken? Can we be glued back together? Are we the same people when we're glued back together? And what does it mean to be whole? And so the project of researching American Muslim efforts against domestic violence has, for me, closely been linked to these questions. So let me tell you a little bit about the book as a whole. Obviously, I can't share everything that's in it with you, and so this is perhaps an invitation to maybe read it. I mean, you know, self-promotion has become important. The academy is part of capitalism. Having said that, for me, it's more about you reading it and engaging with it than it is about you buying it, because I make no money at all from buying it. Like, I'm not going to get rich from advertising it in this way. For me, it's really about the conversation. So Peaceful Families comes out of 10 years of research. That's a very long time for a humanities scholar to work on a project. And one of the reasons for that is that it was incredibly difficult to do in a variety of ways. It's a project that is based on both textual and ethnographic research. I did 6 years of ethnographic research, which consisted of interviews, about 65 of them in all over that period, with Muslim advocates against domestic violence, service providers, religious leaders, and on occasion also people in what in the DV movement is called the mainstream. And I attended over 55 different events, awareness events, workshops, and trainings related to domestic violence in Muslim communities. The textual materials ranged from books to journals, articles, but also include blog posts, YouTube videos, and any other kind of material that, at least in my field, could be considered textual. And I want to make this point here based on Dr. Abbasi's sort of introduction about this as interdisciplinary and interdisciplinary outreach. And I want to say something about interdisciplinarity because it's a coveted term in the academy. We talk about it as a great thing. I have also experienced it as potentially complicated because interdisciplinarity doesn't mean that we're all doing the same thing if we just learn enough things, right? So methodologically and theoretically, we come from different perspectives and we have different toolboxes. And I have borrowed from other fields' toolboxes without making them my own, because that's also not entirely possible. So interdisciplinarity doesn't mean that we're all eventually going to be doing the same thing. And so I'm hoping that sort of offering something from my toolbox or from what I did with my toolbox is useful for you without you ending up as religious studies scholars. And what I do in the book is really, so there's a really important distinction for me between doing research about incidents of domestic violence in Muslim communities, which is your job and the job of social work scholars and criminal justice scholars and sociologists perhaps, and the work that I did, which focused on Muslim efforts against domestic violence. Those are not the same thing, and I think that's an important point. So I'm a religious / Islamic studies scholar, firmly centered in the humanities. And so my interest in this project as an academic was in where and how religion comes into this work, into these efforts. How does Islam show up in this work? And I found, broadly speaking, that this work, these efforts can be divided into 3 distinct but overlapping categories. So one is to raise awareness of domestic violence in Muslim community settings. The second one,
Is the slides matching?
yes, still there.
Oh, sorry.
The second one is to provide direct services to victims and survivors, and the third one is to what I sort of call educating the mainstream, including law enforcement, mainstream service providers, etc. And this slide is full of text. These are just the titles of the chapters of the book, and you don't have to memorize them. I just wanted to show you the range of things I do in this book, and then move to the more specific topic that I promised you I would talk about. What holds this together, what holds the book together, what holds the 3 sort of arms of advocacy and service efforts together is what I call an ethic of non-abuse. And for me, this is a religious ethic of non-abuse. It's the smallest common denominator of the people and frameworks that I interacted with. I might also want to say something, because I think some of you probably do quantitative research. I don't do quantitative research, and so there was no attempt in this study to capture all advocates against domestic violence who identify as Muslim, or all the organizations that do this kind of work. That was technically not possible, and was also not the kind of qualitative analysis that I'm interested in. And so I focused on a number of organizations and advocates sort of through snowball principles, which require building trust, and repeatedly explaining why I was interested in this research. There is, as you can imagine, a lot of suspicion. I had initially expected that the very important and profound presence of anti-Muslim hostility would make my work very difficult, because talking about domestic violence in public means that it happens in what I call the Muslim American public square, which is under the direct surveillance of the US government, the US state, and also sort of the public gaze, right? And so Muslims, even when it's not about domestic violence in this country, are hyper aware of this surveillance on this gaze. And I actually argue in some of my other work that they adjust their behaviors and their public self-representation based on this gaze and these expectations. And so talking about domestic violence clearly immediately has the effect of feeding anti-Muslim hostility, because it confirms the idea that Muslims are Muslim/and Islam, mostly Muslim men, are uniquely violent, and that the sort of the supposed tendency towards violence and terrorism is also expressed in interpersonal relationships, especially in the family. And so I expected the advocates to not want to talk to me about domestic violence, at least not in the sort of like, not making it public in this way. That's not what happened at all. The ethic of non-abuse that I was talking about actually leads people to be so invested in this cause that they are not concerned or not very concerned about public representation, also with the argument that they can affect change with that representation anyways. And I want to come back to this ethic of non-abuse also to say that, of course, this is not just something that's shared among the people I worked with in the project, but also with myself, right? That's my own investment in this work as well. Okay, so finally, coming to this promised resource roadblock topic that I put in the title and want to talk to you about. So I initially encountered this question of resource and roadblock not in those terms. It's probably very familiar to you, but it wasn't to me. I spent a good couple of years just reading up on work on domestic violence in general, the various approaches, the various frameworks. But what I did encounter, what I had encountered even before I started working on this project, was a distinction that often appears in Muslim communal conversations about about how to divide up religion and culture. I'm sure every one of you has heard at least one conversation that goes along those lines, right? So I encountered it in a very specific way in a project that I was working on before, the DV project on Muslim feminist approaches to the Quran, where the distinction between religion and culture makes it possible for Muslim feminists to insist that Islam is not a patriarchal religion, and that whatever patriarchy and with that misogyny comes into Islam comes from different Muslims, and by extension from Muslim majority cultures. Right, so like it performs a very particular kind of move in the context of that work. But it also shows up in Muslim communal conversations, frequently actually in conversations about hijab, for example, in conversations about how to hold a Muslim wedding. What is religion? What is religiously required? What's the cultural part of this? Or in a slightly more entertaining way, in annual and without fail happening debates about what to have for iftar, right? So like the practice of the Prophet Muhammad versus the samosas happens every year, right? So this is a religion and culture conversation of a kind. And in the context of anti-DV work, so in my project, it appeared very, very quickly to me, most prominently in the way in which it distances Islam from domestic violence. So what happens is that advocates can say, and do say, that Islam, I want to put it in quotation marks, is against domestic violence, which by extension, what we mean by that is that God is against domestic violence, right? So like if we think of Islam as a manifestation of God's will, then Islam is against domestic violence, which then in turn leads to the question of what causes domestic violence, or why does it happen and how does it happen? And aside from the fact that, of course, there are ways to think about the incidence of domestic violence in all communities and in all strata of society and in all social classes as perhaps an argument for why domestic violence has nothing intrinsically to do with Islam. What happens in these conversations is basically that culture is to blame, right? So it's Muslim cultures plural as well, that are to blame for why domestic violence happens specifically in Muslim communities. And I want to reference here a very incisive piece by Dr. Zarina Grewal, who is a professor here at Yale, called Death by Culture, that was written and published in the aftermath of Asya Zubair's murder in 2009. And in this piece, Grewal warns of unilaterally blaming culture, so putting the blame on culture for various reasons. She also introduces the idea that culture can be a resource or a roadblock, to at least acknowledge that, but also cautions, and this is really important coming back to anti-Muslim hostility, that in public discourse, most of the time no distinction is made between Muslim culture and Islam as a religion. And so that idea that culture is to blame for domestic violence doesn't do anything to decrease anti-Muslim hostility and racism. There's plenty of work that shows that the notion of culture in predominantly racist ways is only attached to non-white people in the US context, especially in DV work, right? So culture can be blamed in these particular ways, and to connect with what we heard here earlier, white people don't have culture. And so culture can't be a problem. So as I said, Dr. Grewal's piece also points to the possibility of culture as a resource though, and that's really important. And so that brings me to this resource roadblock framework in earnest. And as I said, I think that that framework is familiar to those working in domestic violence and more broadly in gender-based violence in that movement. And has been around, as far as I can tell, for a long time. I haven't done any sort of like where does it originate kind of study, but it's been around as a framework for a long time. And the way it usually shows up is, especially in clinical work and in the service sector, is to evaluate aspects of a person's life that can be assessed as a resource or a roadblock. It often, and you're probably more familiar with this than I am, it often looks at things like family. Are there people in a family that can be a resource for a victim or survivor? And are there others that need to be identified as a roadblock? Friends, community, as I said, sometimes culture also can be assessed in that way. What hadn't happened until relatively recently is to also include religion in that framework. And the main reason for why religion was for a long time not included and is still not included in a lot of secular mainstream work is that gender-based violence and domestic violence mainstream frameworks are often linked to feminist theory and activism. And within feminist theory, and I'm not criticizing feminist theory here per se, I identify as a feminist scholar, but in the context of this work, feminist ideas about gender-based violence have a very complicated impact on what is and isn't possible for conversation. And so with regards to religion as a resource or roadblock for the longest time, and that's still evident in much of mainstream work, religion was only perceived as a problem. So only as a roadblock, as something that, that because it is considered by many feminists inherently patriarchal, can't be part of any kind of resource. And as I said, there is sort of the introduction of this idea that religion could be either or. And I want to just give you a quote here from the Faith Trust Institute that says religious teachings can serve as either a resource or a roadblock in addressing the issues of sexual and domestic violence. As religious communities, our responsibility is to minimize any barriers facing abused members of our congregations, very Christian term, and to maximize the resources that exist within our faith traditions. And as far as I can tell, Faith Trust Institute has been using this framework since at least the late 1980s. I was introduced to it by the Peaceful Family Project, which is one of the organizations that I worked with and interacted with. And so I'm very grateful that I was introduced to it, and I have since found, even after I finished writing the book, that approach or that framework to think about resources and roadblocks is extremely useful. I'm currently working on a project on sexual abuse in Muslim communities and efforts against sexual abuse. And you can see how like the sort of overlap in these as issues in our communities also means that this framework is gonna be helpful going forward. So let me talk a little bit now about Islam specifically. And I decided to start by looking at Islam as a roadblock rather than a resource, so that we end with resources. And what you see here, I'm gonna try and explain these a little bit. And if you have questions, I'm happy to talk more about any of those. So the first one on here on the slide, as you see, is patriarchal gender norms. And what I mean by that, as a feminist, I'm critical of those. I will say, as a side note, that many of the advocates I worked with do not identify as feminists or don't do so publicly. And so there's a whole lot more to say about this sort of question of what the relationship between Islam and feminism might be. But what I mean here is Islam can become a roadblock when patriarchal gender norms are claimed to be Islamic. The second one is an obvious one, also something that is introduced to the conversation about domestic violence by religious advocates against domestic violence, not exclusively Muslim ones. They are clearly also Christian and Jewish and other religious efforts against domestic violence in this country who have added the notion of spiritual abuse. So utilizing verses from the Quran, hadith, and other kinds of materials in order to commit domestic violence in a variety of forms and to justify it as well. So that sort of form of spiritual abuse clearly uses Islam in a way that would be a roadblock. Something that we're all familiar with is an argument that surfaces in Muslim communities constantly, which is that victims and their supporters are asked to keep abuse private, to not publicly speak about it. And here too, there's a couple of hadith that always come up in that conversation, you know, like about not publicizing your brother's shame and talking in private about the sins that people commit, but not in public. The next one on here I will come back to. It's Quran 434, a particularly complicated verse that I will say something more on the next slide. We know that perpetrators of domestic violence are often people in positions of authority, which makes talking about their abuse even more complicated. They are defended even in the face of evidence. And so that dimension of the way our communities work in terms of authority figures and who we consider an authority figure makes Islam a potential roadblock as well. And then something that comes up very strongly in my research, which is arguments that move away from attention to individuals as victims and survivors, and argue, for example, against separation in cases of domestic violence in order to maintain the family structure. So to focus on the wider, the unit of the family as more important than the suffering of the individual. And I put anti-Muslim hostility here again because, as I said earlier, the way Islam is sort of brought up in conversations as to blame can figure into this Islam as a roadblock yet again. Help.
Yeah, I know. Sure.
No.
This one?
Yes, this one. But can you? Yes. Okay. So this way, I got all of them.
And I'll move this around.
Thank you. I'm old enough to have technical difficulties. So I put the verse that you probably are familiar with on here in a translation by Keisha Ali, who has made the argument that one way to deal with the very important questions about what this verse might mean and might be telling us is to retain the Arabic terms. And I put the sort of translations in brackets here, but that very question of how do we translate these terms is sort of the crux of the issue, right? So I don't know, I'm going to assume that you're all familiar with this verse because there is no conversation about domestic violence in which it doesn't come up inevitably. It's most often not the advocates themselves that bring it up, it's always someone else who is demanding that this verse somehow be addressed. And I want to say here something that I often say to my students, it's complicated, very, very complicated, right? And so we have many, many different interpretations of this verse. There's also a lot going on considering how short it looks, at least in English, right? So there's the question of Qawama, of Qawamun. There's the question of what it means to be qanitat, and there's the question of what nushuz means here. In the context of domestic violence, the most important piece is the very, is sort of towards the end, which is this question whether idr bihinna actually means to strike, right? So, and it is important, I think, to recognize that these three pieces, so qawamun, qanitat, nushuz, and then daraba are connected with each other, but that they're often also discussed separately, right? So some scholars have only looked at the qawama question, and some have looked at what the qawama question might have to do with husbands being told to admonish their wives and abandon them in their beds, and then perhaps strike them. So whether daraba means to strike or not is one of the important questions in this conversation, but it's not the only one. So in scholarly literature, and there is a whole pile of scholarly literature on just this verse in its historical as well as in contemporary sort of engagements and interpretations. Aisha Chaudhry's book, Domestic Violence and the Islamic Tradition, is an important example of that, but there is a whole lot more. That addresses how this verse has been interpreted, who has interpreted it, how and why, and what that means. The way it came up in my research with advocates was that they had to address this verse. And like everyone else, they had difficulty sort of figuring out how to get away from it. That's sort of the most significant way, I think, in which this happens. And so what I saw was everything from daraba doesn't actually mean to hit in this context. There are quite a few people who have made that argument on a spectrum, if you want to think of a sort of religious spectrum from very progressive to pretty conservative. That interpretation that it doesn't mean to hit, that it means primarily to walk away, is not connected to just one piece on this interpretive spectrum. Others have argued that the Prophet Muhammad didn't hit his wives, and that is an argument, that is a way to deal with this verse in the Quran. So who are we to do something that, or argue for something that the Prophet actually didn't do? And it's also pretty clearly demonstrated in the textual tradition that the Prophet Muhammad told his followers that the best of them do not strike their wives, right? So like these sort of pieces to that. I want to argue here that the very existence of many different interpretations challenges the authority of the text itself. So if we have many different interpretations, how do we know which one matters the most, which one is true? Now, again, as a religious studies scholar, I can tell you that my approach to Islam and to the interpretive tradition is that the act of interpretation is a continuous project. Muslims have engaged in that interpretive project all throughout the 1400 plus years of history. And I also think that there is no ultimate answer. But that's really complicated in the context of work against domestic violence, right? So like if there are other interpretations that say, yes, it does mean to strike, then how do you convince people that the interpretation that it doesn't mean that is the correct one, right? So like I want to raise it as an issue. I don't have a wonderfully wrapped up, beautiful answer to what to do with that. I want to raise it as an issue. So, Islam as a resource. So one thing I found, and as I said, a lot of this is drawing from interviews with advocates and from these trainings and workshops and awareness events. So I observed what kinds of arguments people use in these events, the advocates that I worked with and that I observed there. The most important one to me is to draw on the Quran, not through a particular verse, but through an overarching principle, which is the establishment of justice. The idea of justice juxtaposed with injustice, and so justice as a comprehensive ethical framework in which domestic violence represents a particular form of injustice that is done by Muslims to other Muslims, and that it is often in that same context also described as oppression, as dhulm. So that, I think, is the most powerful way to, in some ways, also get away from the single verse in the Quran that might not speak to that, right? So like focusing on something that is part of modern and contemporary approaches to the Quran, which is thematic work, that looks at where does the question of justice come up in the Quran, how does it come up, but to look at a wider picture in order to then make a more specific argument. The second piece I want to offer here is another verse in the Quran that I also want to come back to. I have a separate slide for that as well. I added something that I don't see on here, but that I want to bring into the conversation because it plays an important role in the book, which is the notion of protective or benevolent patriarchy. So I found that many of the approaches of advocates are based on what they don't call protective patriarchy, but what is a framework that argues that if patriarchy works the way it is supposed to, men are actually responsible for protecting women and children from abuse. And so it is a sort of breach of their mandate to be protectors and maintainers to engage in domestic violence. So you can see that sort of like an internal to Islam type of conversation that in some ways refuses to engage with the question of feminism and patriarchy, but that is a very effective framework that works, that meets communities where they, for the most part, are at in their own thinking. I already brought up the Prophet Muhammad, so using Islam as a resource means talking about Muhammad's conduct with his wives and lifting him up as al-insan al-kamil, who is the perfect man and was also the perfect husband, and so was a model or is a model for Muslims into the contemporary period for how to conduct oneself in their marriages. And that goes back to the Prophet never hit his wives, right? So here Islam easily becomes a resource coming out of the conversation about where Islam is a roadblock. And then connected to the question of family over individual, an argument that I repeatedly found that often shows up in the discourses of Islamic religious leaders and scholars is to argue that domestic violence is bad for Muslim children. Witnessing it is bad for Muslim children, and that in turn is an argument for why we need to end domestic violence or prevent it from happening in the first place. Okay, so here's this verse from the Quran that you might not know the number of, but that you've all heard and all seen before because it shows up pretty much in every nikah ceremony, right? So, and among his signs is that he created for you mates from among yourselves that you may dwell in tranquility, sakina, with them, and he has put love, mawadda, and mercy, rahmah, between your hearts, verily, and that are signs for those who reflect. In advocacy work, not only in nikah ceremonies, this verse shows up as the foundation for the Islamic marriage ideal. So having tranquility or peace and having love, mawadda is a very particular kind of love. I don't know if you know, but Arabic has like 15 different terms for love that sort of denote different types of love. This is the sort of comforting kind, not the super passionate, sex-oriented kind, but a kind of love that lasts and that nurtures both people in the marital relationship. And so, okay. So this verse is the foundation for Islamic marriage in its ideal form. And it's not difficult to see how, if that gets juxtaposed with domestic violence, right? So you can't have tranquility and love and mercy in your marital relationship if you're also hitting your wife. Those two are mutually exclusive frameworks. And I will also say, and I talk a lot more about that in the book, that advocates often, because there is so much silence in communities, offer not domestic violence awareness events, but events about Islamic marriage. Muslims do want to talk about marriage a lot, actually, right? So like anything related to marriage, Islamic marriage, Muslims and children will get people to show up for these conversations. And what advocates often do is then say, so here's this marriage ideal. And you can see that engaging in any form of domestic violence goes against this ideal. So this is how awareness of domestic violence and what it might look like is developed and brought to communities in terms of awareness. So it can also help recognize when domestic violence is happening. In closing, I want to point out that the resource roadblock approach itself is binary. Right? It's a either or kind of a thing. But I think you've seen in what I've shown you here that it's in fact much more complex and that there is potential overlap, right? And also a whole lot of negotiation. And especially engagement with the Quran and Sunnah as sources, as our main resources as Muslims for what we're supposed to do in the world, does raise the question of religious authority. So who is reading the Quran and the Sunnah? Who is offering these interpretations? Who has access to the texts? What language do we have access to the texts in? Who do we consider scholarly authority figures? Who do we believe when they say that daraba doesn't mean to hit or to strike in that particular Quranic passage? And so from the humanities perspective that I come from, all of these are questions and possibilities. I'm not a policy person, I don't have to make recommendations, but I want to point out that this question of who has the authority to speak for the Quran, who have to speak for God, and who are the interpretive communities that are built around particular interpretations is something that we need to continue to think about. And I would also point out that using the resource roadblock approach means that we have to recognize that bringing in Islam/religion into the struggle against domestic violence carries great responsibility. It's not an easy fix and it's not a quick fix, and I think we shouldn't use it as that, but stay aware of the nuances, even when those nuances feel like pitfalls and ultimately unanswerable questions. And I'm happy to answer some questions. I made it under the time I set for myself. I'm very proud of myself. But I'm also very happy to be in touch by email. I put my email there. I'm not difficult to find on the internet. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Hammer, for your very important talk. I think your talk and your book highlight, when we're talking about mental health, the different fields that come together to inform that work, right? Most of us here are mental health in the traditional sense, psychologists, psychiatrists, social work, but also the humanities and how that can inform the work that we do in very important ways. In how you described, just describing the work that is being done, right? We talk about looking at more specifically what needs to be done, the ways we work with clients, but what about describing the work that is being done by the advocates? So thank you for your important work. We do have a few questions. Some have come through our chat and some are in the audience. Just as a reminder, if you are in the audience and you have questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we will come around with a note card and we'll bring it up here. If you are joining us virtually, of course, you can put it in the chat and we will address that as well. I will begin with the first question that comes from our virtual audience. The question is, you mentioned advocates' reticence to identify as feminists, either publicly or because that's just not how they identify. In the book, you provided a layered account of the range of stigmas attached to feminism in some Muslim communities. Can you please share more how the advocates navigate this identity as not feminists in Muslim and interfaith anti-DV context? The richness really comes out in the book. And I can give you we took a screenshot, so if it's a little bit long, I'll leave it up here for you to break that down. Move out of the way.
That is a very good question, but it's also a really hard question. And I will say that what I also do in the book is wrestle with my own sort of struggles, because I came to this project as a feminist scholar pretty convinced that patriarchy is the problem, right? And so encountering people who didn't share that conviction, right, who are invested in a framework where patriarchy is a good thing if it's done right. So patriarchy could be a resource, not just a roadblock, that it was in sort of my understanding, raised ethical questions for me, right? About how to write about people who I fundamentally disagree with in some way. And I will say that I found that experience of being questioned in that very fundamental way really humbling. And it reminded me of the ethical responsibility to be careful with how and what we critique as scholars, and what the purpose of that critique is, what we want to get out of that critique. And so I want to make sure that I don't misrepresent the people that I worked with. I'm finding still also now with the Sexual Abuse in Muslim Communities project that there are fault lines that emerge, and that whether one identifies as feminist or with feminist frameworks means different access to communities, and it means different opponents and allies that will appear on the scene, right? So there are people in our communities who don't want to be associated with a project that self-identifies as informed by feminism. And there are others that don't want to be associated with a project that doesn't. And so what was interesting to me was, and that's in interesting ways related, so I was also interested in how advocates draw on scholarship, on scholars, right? In the academy, we tend to think that we as scholars just know everything, it's a terrible misunderstanding, right, of what scholars are supposed to do. And we often think that we should be telling advocates how to do what we do. And advocates, on the other hand, and this goes back to the question of authority, draw on scholars to support them as authority figures, especially religious scholars, right? And imams in the context of the US as well. Whether all of our imams are also religious scholars, I think is questionable, but they're religious authority figures. And so advocates often sort of downplay their own exegetical work and their own frameworks, or link them to the authority of mostly male religious scholars and leaders in order to benefit from that authority in addressing the issues in the community. And so it was really interesting for me to see towards the end of my ethnographic work that I started seeing work appear, at least in sort of bibliographies at the end of a PowerPoint, or like further resources that I didn't see when I started this research in 2009. So I remember there's one event where I was just blown away to see Amina Wadud's book, Quranic Woman, listed there as a resource for this conversation. And in some ways, I think that was unthinkable 5 years before that. And so I think it's both the question of what's the connection to Muslim feminist research, and how does that show up, and the question of how people self-identify as feminists or don't. Some did and some didn't, and we often had this conversation about what it would mean. And I'll end with an anecdote from one of the awareness events where I was standing in the lobby with a group of advocates who had just done an awareness event at a mosque. Does the mosque have a lobby? Like, I mean, you know what I mean, like the entrance area. Someone asked me what I worked on before I did this project. It was a male advocate from one of the organizations, and I said, oh, I wrote a book about, you know, women and prayer. I don't know if you know, but I wrote a book about women-led prayer and Muslim feminist activism. And so he sort of looked at me sideways and said, well, I hope it's not something that supports women-led prayer and these feminists. And I was like, oh. And then I thought to myself, what do I say now? Like, what's an appropriate thing to say in that context? Because saying, oh no, it was on women-led prayer and I identify as a Muslim feminist would have potentially meant cutting off that conversation, right? Because as a Muslim feminist, I may not be trusted in that same way. It's not hard to figure out that I identify in that way if you just do a little bit of Googling. But in that moment, I sort of recognized how complicated it is, right? Because I needed access. And that particular conversation could cut off access from communities. And so I can sort of empathize, I think, with advocates who want to meet communities where they're at, because that's the only way the work is effective, but who might also have a long-term vision for Muslim communities and societies that strays very far away from that mainstream understanding. I hope that helped.
Thank you. We do have a few other questions. We may not have time to go through all of them, just so that you know if you put, sent in a question. But we will, I'll share them with Dr. Hammer, and hopefully we can find a way to get the answers to you. This question states, have you come across compelling work, research, or projects on prophetic male masculinity?
So I can't cite things off the top of my head. There is interesting work. One person I want to point you to is Aman Ladasandi, who wrote a book several years ago called The Crisis of Islamic Masculinity. That in one chapter, which is my favorite chapter in the book, talks about the different models of prophetic masculinity in the Quran based on looking at various prophetic figures and their family situation. So not all prophets were married, some came from what he describes as dysfunctional families. What does that mean? What does that tell us about prophets and families? So that's an example. There is, I think, interesting work in the mainstream to think about positive masculinity, and I'm sure there are people who very specifically look at positive Muslim models for masculinity that focus on Prophet Muhammad. It's definitely an area where we need more work, right? So when we talk about masculinity, we either do it in the context of sexuality and queer studies, which often focuses on queer masculinities. There's sort of a call that I've seen across perhaps more activist spaces as well to talk about positive masculinity, to develop positive models, and I think Muslims could play a very important role in that work. I'm sorry that I can't, off the top of my head, think of other examples. I'm sure there are some, like somewhere in the back of my head. But I want to encourage that type of work definitely as well.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and this is a pretty quick one. The question is, in your book, you mentioned a 90-minute film. How can we access it? Garments for one another. And I'm wondering if this is the Peaceful Families.
It is.
Okay, but if you know how to, did you want to address it? I also know that we have folks from Peaceful Families Project here, so if you want to find them, Dr. Denise's birthday is in the audience, Sahani Shadri, so if you want to ask, you can ask them directly if you're interested in finding out that phone.
So the short answer is I bought the film and others that the Faith Trust Institute produced. So I have like a box with resources that has a good old-fashioned DVD in it. And I think at the time when I was doing my research, PFP was also using a DVD when they were doing events. I'm not aware, I don't know if you know, but I'm not aware that it's accessible in some other way.
There are actually two ways. So we do have the DVD sets, which are, despite the fact that it's a DVD, is amazing because it does come with a manual and other kinds of things. There is also a way through Faith Institute to pay a fee and to be able to use it on an online version.
Oh, great. So the online version happened since I finished my ethnographic work, but that's helpful. Thank you. Did everyone hear that? I don't know. Yeah. Okay.
So just to make sure everybody heard that, and again, you can contact Peaceful Families Project directly. There is a DVD version that you can access, but it's also available through Faith Trust Institute for a small fee online, which is newer. Or not that the version is, but it's newly available online. I want to thank our speaker again. If we could give her a round of applause. A couple of announcements. So I'm going to use this as an opportunity, since we're talking about domestic violence, to piggyback on something I mentioned in another lecture yesterday, and an announcement went out yesterday. In collaboration with the Peaceful Families Project, I'm doing a research study looking at American Muslims' beliefs, experiences, and thoughts about domestic violence. It is a survey. If you identify as Muslim, living in the United States, over the age of 18, you can take it. There was an announcement made yesterday with the link, but if you have questions, you can also directly ask me, ask Peaceful Families Project. Also, my name is Dr. Bumi Oyewuwo, if you don't know who I am by now. So feel free to ask me, and please take that survey and share it widely. There's a lot we need that information. I talked about it yesterday, just needing, what do we need to know? Where can we intervene? How can we prevent? And also at the very practical level, having data so that we can get funding for this work, because it's very, very important work that people are doing on the ground. And then there's one other announcement. Sorry. Dr. Umber has an announcement? Sorry.
So Dr. Umber, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farah. What a pleasure. Most people here don't know me. I lived in the Middle East for a good 25 years, and I was in Malaysia before that. And I was a clinical psychologist in Michigan for a long time. But Dr. Farah asked me to talk a little bit about the journal that we have, the Journal of Muslim Mental Health, with which I have been associated from the start, which was probably back in 2007. We started publishing the journal with Taylor and Francis. And for some administrative reasons, it was then stopped, and we started publishing with the Michigan Press. Dr. Hamada and Dr. Farah have been both very instrumental in the publication of the journal. From Michigan, she's from Michigan State University, but the journal is published from University of Michigan Press. So we have an editorial board. I have been associated with them as a associate editor, section editor for both book review and faith-based editor for many years. Why I am saying this is because we are in need of reviewers. We have lots of submissions, however, because of this beautiful conference, I was just asking, and I think that without exaggeration, we had several dozen research presentations in this beautiful conference that I'm encouraging and requesting the presenters to submit their research to us in this journal. And part of the problem that has been with the turnaround is that we have a lack of reviewers. So we're also looking for good reviewers from the academia to send their names to us. We have a website. I created a little discussion group on the conference app about promoting the Journal of Muslim Mental Health. When I was in Malaysia, I ordered it through my university there. In UAE, I did that. So I hope that, and now it's free. You don't even have to have university buy it. So this is to promote Muslim mental health. So we hope that for our researchers around the globe, we will get the support that we deserve. Thank you.